3.2 million public school teachers in America. Every single one of them gets evaluated. Most of those evaluations take 45 minutes a year. And the question nobody in education wants to answer out loud, does it actually make teachers better? We found someone who runs the system from the inside at every level and has done it in 3 major cities. Here we go.
Welcome to KDN, the Kid Development Network. I'm Sarah Habib, founder of the Calm Caterpillar, and with me is my co-host Eric Elias. If you're new here, this show is about the systems around kids, not the parenting tips, the actual systems, the ones adults build and kids live inside every day. Our guest today has been a classroom teacher, an assistant principal, a regional superintendent, a chief of schools, a deputy superintendent of Detroit Public Schools, and the former superintendent and CEO of Cincinnati Public Schools. She now runs the Right Way Leadership Group. If you want to understand how the system around teachers actually works, there's no better person on the planet to ask. Ironetta Wright, welcome to KDN.
Thank you so much for having me today, Sarah. And Eric, nice to meet you.
Great to be. I'm happy you're here. Okay, first topic. So we're going back to one of the throwbacks. I don't know if you remember ratemyprofessor.com. It was like the early 2000s or a little late 2000. You could go on and see what people said about a professor, but there was no moderation. You could write whatever you wanted. And in fact, students did. I think the only requirement was an edu email. And it was back in the day where you kind of could say things on the internet in a small areas without accountability. And so kind of leading from that, that was a horrible way for professors to get feedback. It was a horrible way to figure out what they were doing wrong. I think one of the most ridiculous reviews we read was, "I'd rather eat a bowl full of spiders than spend another 45 minutes in his class." And so
Wow.
it's a funny reference, but it obviously wasn't effective for helping those professors improve and those teachers improve.
Which raises the real question. If Rate My Professor was basically useless, and it was for college teachers, but what does an actual effective teacher evaluation look like? Most parents genuinely have no idea, right? It's not a website, it's some sort of system within the school, a whole infrastructure. And Ironetta, you've run that infrastructure. So what does quality effective teacher evaluation look like to you?
Yeah, so I think that it's really important to recognize that it's not just a one-time, one-stop shop at compliance. All too often we think about evaluations and what evaluations look like. And I think if you talk to teachers, many teachers will share with you that their quote unquote evaluation system is probably not the most effective for them. It's not the most efficient. Sometimes, you're going into a classroom and it's a checklist of do's and don'ts or dids during that time. So the ones that I've found that have been the most effective are ones where it's ongoing, right? Where you have leaders that first understand instruction and what quality instruction should look like, that there is clarity around instructional purpose and why you're looking for certain things in the classroom, that you have a focus on students. What are students learning? What are they able to do? And is their thinking clear about what they're seeing in the classroom? What is the rigor for the activities that are happening in the classroom and complexity of what's going on so that you are connecting students to what they should be learning? How are you looking at understanding and checks for understanding and making certain that whatever it is that you're teaching in the class, along the way, you're ensuring that students are receiving the information that's being shared with them and that students are a part of the learning. One of the most exciting professional learning opportunities that I had, and this was back when I was a high school principal, but I worked with a coach. And one of the things that the coach we talked about often was really making certain that we spend time looking at what the children are doing. And so from that, I coined, and I didn't create this, I heard it somewhere over the years, but it worked. The one who's doing the talking is doing the learning. And so do we have students that are engaged in learning? Are they excited about what they're learning? And are we seeing that there is some level of differentness? We would call that in the world of education differentiation in terms of our education jargonese. But are we seeing that there is some level of differentiated or different types of support for students that need it the most? And last but not least for me, because I have one more after that, but because I do believe so much in data, are we using the data of instruction to make certain that we're monitoring what our students are doing, and we're using that to recraft and reflect if necessary. And last but not least, that our teachers are taking ownership for what they're doing in classrooms. In the era that we're in now, a lot of teachers are, there are so many different ways for them to get lesson plans, but are they internalizing the lesson plan that they have because they are the one that's doing the instruction for the students? So using all of those things, including self-reflection, to make certain that they're getting what they need. So the bottom line is it's more, again, than just a check off and a checklist, but really getting in depth into what's happening in the classroom and how students are benefiting.
That's so great. Last week we had Jimmy Zuniga on, and he was talking all about how that data that we get from a classroom, whether or not we're using that for a teacher evaluation, is so important. And you bring it up again, and I just really want to, remind our listeners that we have the ability to collect such rich data from classrooms, and schools might have this data, but it's how are they using the data to really make choices and informed decisions about what's going on in their classrooms and whether or not lesson plans are working. One question I have off of what you've just said, not sure if we're going to have to move on in a second. I think we've got like 30 seconds left on this segment, is what sort of trust is required for the feedback loop you just talked about? So there are many different inputs, right? So how do you get that trust for the teachers
I
and the
think that
administration?
teachers have to feel comfortable with the leader that's giving them the feedback. And is the feedback that's being provided by the leader actionable? Is it something that they can take today and go back in their classroom and do tomorrow? That's going to make a difference in their level of instruction and whether or not the students are understanding what's happening in class.
I love both of that. And that takes us into the next piece. What happens when an evaluation actually flags a teacher that needs improvement?
Right. So it's tough because, over the course of the years, so many people use evaluations for a lot of different things, right? And we would like to say that evaluations should be tools for growth, but sometimes they have been used more punitive than they are used for tools for growth. So first of all, the teacher, as I shared earlier, the teacher has to feel confident that the person giving them evaluation knows what they're talking about and they know what they're looking for, and that they also have their interest at. I mean, we're in an era now where, we have a national teacher shortage, and it's really important that instead of just thinking about teachers that we bring in and teachers that leave, is how are we truly spending the time to develop those that are there with our students every day? Teachers that are teaching, over the course of the years, and this is my 33rd year as an educator, but, we teach because we want to teach. And even teachers that are in the classroom now, they're teaching because that's what they want to do. There's a love of the craft and there's a love for the kids. And I don't believe that there is any teacher that walks into the classroom that says, I'm going to do the worst job that I can today. No, they want to do the best job that they can. And they do need feedback in terms of, making that better. When I think about coaches, I often think about Michael Jordan, right, who's one of my go-to when I think about it. And if Michael Jordan had a coach at the time that he retired, and to me, he's still, we can get into the Michael and Kobe debate, but he's still, to me, like the best of all time. If he still had a coach, then everyone can benefit from having a coach. And as we think about teachers and the feedback that they get in the classroom, that administrator, that principal serves as a coach in a coaching capacity to give authentic feedback so that it truly makes a difference for students.
Okay, I've got two hot takes. I'm going to do the first one really quickly just because you mentioned principals. We were talking with our other guest last week about how often should a principal be observing their teachers and what should their day look like? I just got to know what you think on this. How often should a principal be spending in their teachers' classrooms?
Yeah, some of the most impactful data says that to get to improve student outcomes, a leader should be in instructional leadership activities at least 2 hours a day. And so most of their time should be spent around instructional leadership activities. Now, that's a combination of in-class visits, of giving feedback to teachers, of looking at what's happening in terms of their instructional program and how their environment is responding to that instructional program, of looking at curriculum and determining whether or not the curriculum that you're using is really really meeting the mark for your alignment to your state standards. But the most of the time really should be spent in instructional leadership activities, which includes classroom observations.
Thank you for that.
What happens after those activities? You're coaching the teacher, you're trying to improve them, authentic feedback is happening, and then they still have to go through what I'm going to call from the business perspective, a PIP, a performance improvement plan. There's no way anyone loves that, but walk us through some of your experiences, working with teachers on their PIPs, and what does that mean?
Right. So I think one thing that's really important, it goes back, Sarah, to a question that you asked a moment ago about trust, right? And so, let's face it, there are some times when even going through whether we call it a performance improvement plan or some kind of growth monitoring plan, there are some times that at the end of that, you have to say, this just did not meet the mark, right? And this is just not getting us where we need to be. And children are counting on us. Like, it's important for us to be honest with educators around where they are and whether or not they're meeting the needs of students. But one of the areas that I think becomes challenging, and this has been in a lot of my experiences, unfortunately, is, a lot of people don't want to talk about data and whether or not data is actually improving
You
and
need the
who
data.
is actually the person responsible if the data doesn't improve. And I could say some things right now that would probably get me in a whole lot of trouble when it comes to that. But I do believe that children in a classroom environment should have improved outcomes when they leave that classroom environment. I believe that. But I also believe that that is also paired with high quality support for teachers, that it's paired with clarity around what needs to improve, that it's paired with an expectation that we are going through this process together and that it's not something that's done to you. That expectation is done with you. So solely you're not the only one responsible. Education is so difficult because we often share, or I often share, we're not creating widgets, right? And so all of our students come into our classrooms with all of these different needs. They come with a different set of skills from the time they come into the classroom, and teachers are expected to take all of those things and impact positive change. And that's hard when you think about it, when you have, 20, 30, 15, 18 different personalities coming into your room. So finding the synergy in that and what that support looks like, and the ability to be vulnerable, to say, okay, this is something that I really don't understand. Where can I get help? What does assistance look like?
So there's so many things you just said that I want to respond to, but I'm going to respect the time and the subject. One of them in particularly made me laugh. The next one I really want to talk though through is, so a teacher's been put on a PIP, whatever we're going to call it, right? Some sort of performance improvement plan. In your experience, do you feel that in that moment, teachers either get better or do they leave, right? You were the superintendent of a large school district. You were the deputy superintendent of a different district. What happened to most teachers put on that PIP?
Well, what are the elements that we're not talking about? Like, you're referring to it right now kind of as an either or a black or white. And the truth is it's not that, because, there are also other elements and other factors that play into that. What should happen, what shouldn't happen, who should be involved, who shouldn't be involved. Leadership says they need to have a performance improvement plan. Others say that they don't know that that's important. So there are a lot of different things that go into that. So if we're looking at it from the purest sense of improvement, right, of a growth tool and growth monitoring, I think that the first thing that you really do have to look at is the trust. Trust, number one. Number two, who is providing the assistance to the teacher, and are they equipped to give the teacher the kind of experiences that they need and the kind of support that they need? Many of our schools over the course of the time have had what we called instructional coaches, right? But instructional coaches did not teach all subjects. So they have to really understand the depth of what they taught, as well as what does pedagogy really look like, and what does quality instruction look like, and how am I able to give you feedback even in a content that I may not be as comfortable and confident in. And whether some people like it or not, that's one of the ways right now that I'm going to say a dirty, dirty, dirty term, but that's one of the ways right now that AI can be supportive, because it does allow for differentiation for teachers in the space of pedagogy. So if they do have that instructional coach in their room, they need a person sitting there looking at them and watching them and giving them support and giving them kudos and helping them correct. Years ago, we used to, call it the 360 observations, where you would put a headphone in your ear and the other person would put a headphone in their ear, and you were giving them play by play for what they were doing in the classroom, right? As we're really thinking about improving. But now, being able to give some of that authority, autonomy, and control, independence to a teacher by possibly using an AI tool where they can, they can hear what it is that they're doing, and then that tool can give them feedback, but not negating the importance of having a person in their room that's looking at them, that's giving them feedback, that's giving them support, that's giving them encouragement, and doing it also in real time with real.
I think that's a great example of and, right? It's not either or, it's and. We need both
It's
of those
definitely
things.
and.
100%.
Need the human in the loop for that one.
Definitely and.
Yeah. What's interesting, Ironetta, is that I work predominantly with public schools, but I have been involved with a few private schools. And one of the things people are always asking me, what's the difference between a public school and a private school? I actually think teacher evaluation and feedback and growth is one of the biggest differences. And I just want to call this out here for a second. Because of state requirements, a whole host of things, I think public schools take teacher growth and teacher evaluation really seriously. And I think that that's an area where public schools haven't had to face private schools haven't had to face the same scrutiny. And it's interesting how no matter the environment, teachers do feel that it is a punitive tool. And so I just take a step back, and it's just something that I've really noticed about public schools is that I do think they do a great job of saying we need to review the performance of all of our teachers. And I just want to call that out. That also leads us to believe, though, that principal involvement in that teacher development is so crucial. And, the research shows us, right, a teacher's growth depends almost entirely on the quality of their principal, which means, can we fix teacher development without addressing principal development? And do you see those two clearly linked?
I do, because I am a strong believer in instructional leadership. A lot of my work over the last 2 years since transitioning from the superintendent role has been working with school districts around transforming instruction and education for children. And that's getting to outcomes. Like I said earlier, I expect for students to improve, but they cannot improve by themselves. And I don't expect that teachers are able to do that by themselves. So really, outcome-focused leadership, which is really a course that I teach a lot, and I work with a lot of school districts around the protocol, is really about a framework for improving outcomes for children. And within that framework, outside of analyzing data and building a team and monitoring, is instructional leadership. There are 4 paradigms that we must look at when we're looking at improvement of performance in schools. Those 4 things, and I don't care who you talk to, they may call them 4 different things, but it's essentially the same 4 things. The first, and generally in this order, but the first is climate and culture, systems and structures, climate and culture, instructional leadership, and data analysis. In all of those things. So in order for there to be a level of improvement, there first has to be structures. You got to have systems in place. You have to have structures. What happens when children come into a school building? What happens when they come into a classroom? How are you working with them? And then climate and culture. We want there to be a positive feeling about being in school and what we're doing in school and how we are coexisting with one another. So that's all in the climate and culture space. But the other is instructional leadership. And instructional leadership, when we think about that, that is how are we focused on instruction? How are we focused on making sure that the children are getting what they need in the classroom? How are we supporting it? And from there, how are we analyzing all the data that we have to monitor and correct and celebrate and regroup where we have to, and understand that there is a continuous process, and that improvement is inevitable when those things happen, and they happen consistently. So I do believe that it is a symbiotic relationship, the improvement of educators and the improvement of leaders that are leading those educators. They have to go together. But I also do believe that it's important that we recognize that we're learning, growing, and developing together. So the leader is not just automatically the expert. They have to remain a student of the craft as well. And as they're sharing information, again, going back to what's actionable, not fluff, but what's actionable about what can happen in classrooms for children.
That was such a great framework, such a great structure. It really it hits on things that we just talked with Jimmy. It hits on some of these next pieces, and it also goes to show how much harder. I'm going to say I'm going to make that a statement. How much harder it is for a school's organizational behavior and improvement than a company or a corporation that all has adults, and most of those adults fall into certain protocol behaviors and protocols that it's so much more difficult for teachers and parents and students and administrators to work together.
I think that you're right with that, and I think that it's important that we recognize that. But I also think where I also get into trouble is I don't believe that that can become the excuse, right?
No,
Because the reality
yeah,
is we have children that show up in our classrooms with a lot of different things. And I've said this for a long time. It is not, as an educator, it's not my responsibility to make sure that a child has glasses. That's not my responsibility. But if they don't have glasses, they cannot access what's happening in the classroom. So it is a part of my responsibility to help make sure that they can access what's happening in the classroom. So all of those things that keep the playing field from being level for them, that's how we get involved in those things. Where the challenges have come over the last several years is there has been a shift sometimes such that the social emotional parts or the social needs have become stronger than the academic focus. And that's a challenge for teachers as well. Because I was just talking to teachers last week, and one of the conversations is, I spend so much time trying to make sure that these things are in place that I don't have time to teach my class. And so for us as administrators, how do we make sure that we're providing the right kind of support, that we're engaging families, that we're talking to caregivers about what we need from them? So that as our children do come to classrooms, they're coming in a space where they're ready to get what it is that teachers so badly want to give.
no, I love that. It's the complexity there makes it both a challenge for us to recognize the system and to understand how that system works.
Yes,
That was awesome.
yes.
Very well laid out. With that, from a parent perspective, if a parent's seeing a teacher struggle, how should they escalate that? How should they provide that feedback to the system or to the administrator or even the teacher themselves?
Yeah, so, over the years, I would often say that it doesn't take a lot of training to recognize that there is a challenge. The difference between someone that is trained and someone that is not is that the person that is trained should be able to give strategies that lead toward improvement. And so I think that, as we talk about, as parents are recognizing areas where teachers are struggling, I think that first we want to make certain that there is an alignment between what it means to struggle versus what it means not to struggle. So what I mean, let me give you an example. Sometimes the expectations that we have of teachers can be unrealistic. So if what we have in terms of an expectation is realistic and we see a challenge in that, then that's something that we want to elevate. So if we're saying, I had one parent that said to me one time, well, I've called the teacher, several times and the teacher doesn't return my call. And so my next question is, okay, so when are you calling the teacher?
Right.
And for the times that they told me that they were calling the teacher, they were calling the teacher an average of 7 times a day or interacting with them
Oh,
7 times a day. I wish I was making this up, but I'm not.
that's
Seven
crazy.
times a day because we have such access to technology. So they were doing
Right.
something through, the online portal, and the teacher had given everyone their cell phone number. So they were sending them text message and then they were sending emails. And so because the teacher was not able to respond to the parent every time they sent them a message, they just
Yeah.
knew that there had to be a problem. and their
wow.
child was also having challenges in the classes. And so we were able to talk through that from a parent perspective. I'm a parent, so me being a parent first and having the conversation, like, is your expectation even realistic? Yes, it is fair for you to know what's happening with your child, and if your child is having challenges in a classroom, what could help that improve. It is not realistic for you to think that you have a full-time, on the spot, one person that is responding to you 7 times a day when they also have 19 other students in the classroom. So just imagine if all 20 parents were
Yeah.
doing the same thing, you wouldn't be really
Yeah,
happy
100.
because you're going to say your child is not getting what they
Yeah.
need. So I do think when there are concerns that arise, to answer your question very directly,
Mhm.
if a parent has a concern about a teacher and they've had a conversation and they feel that there's trust for them to have a conversation with the teacher, it then is appropriate for them to have the conversation with administration, but understand that what they may see and what administration may see may not be the same thing. So really having enough trust that they can have the conversation so that so that coherence is something that becomes the overall goal.
That's so important to remember. Not everyone's going to bring the same lens to that view. So you have to recognize that an administration might have a different one. And at the same time, I also have to call out teacher burnout. Teacher burnout is real, and what you just described really contributes to it. So we do have to recognize all of the inputs on the system. There's too many.
Teachers are doing so much, and they are I won't say just dealing with so much. Dealing is something that sounds like it's put upon you. You know, I'm in classrooms all the time, and now I have the luxury of doing that all over this country. And I see some of the most amazing teachers and what they're doing in classrooms with students. And sometimes it's not as easy as we would expect, but they're showing up every day and they're giving their very best. They're wanting what is best for their students, and they're finding a way or making a way to make it happen. And I think that, that's really important. When I was in school, parents would often say, you go to school and you do what the teacher says do, and that's what the expectation was, right? So parents supported teachers sometimes in a very different way. And you can look at it through social media and see some of the stories that teachers have and that teachers deal with sometimes. But the other part of that is they're continuing to show up and they're continuing to give of themselves, their time and their talent to other people's children. And they're doing that because they could choose to do that. We've known for a long time that the profession of teaching, there are a lot of different things that we can do, but we teach because we choose to do that, right? Our skills and our experiences are definitely transferable, but we do what we do because we love it. And when we need support or when things don't go exactly the way that we want it to go, knowing that there's someone else there with you to stand side by side, elbow to elbow, and say, hey, I got you. Now, you may not like exactly what I say, but I'm going to go through this with you. And on the other side of it, we both are going to be better. I think that that's really, really important. The teacher burnout is real. But I think that one of the things that we can do to help improve that is to support teachers, to ask them what they need and try to give them what it is that they're telling us that they need so that they can continue showing up for our kids.
And that's why AI can't replace it.
Absolutely.
But I've
There's
got
no way
one
the
last
AI can do
question
that.
in this block before we move on to the hard stuff. If you could design the teacher development system from scratch, no political constraints, no union negotiations, nothing, you just get to design what you think is best, what is it? Or what's the very first thing you change? I could make it an easier question. What's like the first thing you're going to change?
The first thing that I think that I would focus on, and I don't know if change would be what I would do first. I think the first thing that I would focus on would be a clearly aligned, coherent view of how good is good enough. What are we really expecting to see in a classroom where we say that this is what quality instruction looks like? And so once we align on that, and listen, a lot of really good evaluation systems and programs and feedback protocols, that's what they do. They start with looking at observations in classrooms and having discussion around what we're seeing in presentation and how then we're able to take that from what we see in a video, so to speak, into what we see in a real life classroom. So the first is I would spend a lot of time around pedagogy, around coherence, around what quality instructional delivery looks like. That's the first. And I would do that with teachers and leaders. So it would not be that, again, this is the
Build the
teacher, we're doing
expectation.
it to you, but this is the teacher, this is the leader. From my lens, this is what I see. From my lens, this is what I see. And together, what does that coherence look like for us? That's where I would start. The second piece that I would really focus on again is removing our eyes as much as possible from the teacher and the actions of the teacher to the actions of the students. What are the students doing? Right? Because again, the one who's doing the talking is doing the learning. And so if the students are engaged in those instructional activities and they're gleaning from that what they need to, even if it may not be as aligned to the way that I would want it done, if it's working for the students and the students get it, spending the time there. And I think the third piece would be clearly defining what quality support looks like. What asking teachers, this is an area that we see, we think you need growth here, you think you need growth here. Let's align on those things. And now let's plan together what that support looks like. Again, there are programs that do that, but I don't know if we have as a collective industry, give it as much focus to that as we can, because there's also the element of time. Like there's only so much time in the day. And when we think about deep, and I've had to do all of these. I mean, I've been in scenarios where, we're keeping teachers later during the day, or we're meeting with them on Saturdays, all of those things, because that was the time that was created. But how do we also make sure that we're maximizing time so that we're also minimizing disruption?
That was such a good system and such a good way to lay that out. Thank you. The last piece is we named it the hard stuff. It's definitely something that you hear a lot. We're going to talk about unions. Teacher unions get blamed for making it impossible to
You're going to
develop or
talk to me
remove.
about unions?
I
Okay, wait a minute.
know.
I'll
I
let you
know. Who
go
wrote
ahead. I'm
this
listening.
script?
Okay.
Who wrote
Okay.
this script? I think Sarah
That was
put this one
me.
on
That
there,
was
throwing
me.
you under. You've worked with unions, you've worked on it with the teacher improvement. Is that reputation fair? Or we can take an opinion and kind of address it and say what's been your experience with unions and trying to improve teachers?
So I think when I think about I have to really use my collective experience with unions because, over my career, I've always worked with unions. And my general experience working with unions was one that was positive, where there was a level of respect between me and the union leads that I realized that they had a job to do and I had a job to do. And we were able to have mutual respect. We kept the lines of communication open. They trusted me enough to know that if something was wrong, I wasn't going to support it. And if something was right, I wasn't going to say that it was wrong. I think about when I went into my role as a superintendent, one of my recommendations came from my former union president. And I think that was because, and even today, we still have a relationship because they know that I've always been open, honest, and fair. And so I think that collectively, we have a job to do as leaders and administrators, and we also have to respect that union leads have a job to do as well. So when we have that mutual respect, we can get some work done. I think of experiences that I've had where I was really able to lead, strong outcomes for students. It was also with recognizing that things needed to shift and things needed to change. And, you know, in accountability, sometimes it's uncomfortable, right? When you
It's hard.
when you really believe that children should improve and that academic achievement should matter and that there is a way and a format to do that. And it may be different than what you've done before, but it's necessary to get to outcomes and outcomes for students. So I think that everyone has their place. It's always odd to me when I hear, or as I've heard, people say things about me when it comes to unions that just isn't true. My father was a part of a union my entire life. My dad, that's what he did. He was a master welder. That's a unionized role. My family moved to Michigan, in the late 50s, in the late 50s, early 50s. to work in the plants. You don't get more unionized than UAW, right?
Yeah.
And so when I think about that, I've always had a respect for them and a respect for the work that they do. And honestly, I still do. I believe that there is a way, and there's a way to move forward, and there's a way to continue the work when you get individuals that are committed and that are level in what their thoughts are, and they're willing to be honest. So I do think, I think that there is still definitely a place of respect that goes along with that. And there is a way for us to continue because, again, just like I believe that for all children, I believe that our leaders want the best for kids as well, even though we're not always aligned on how to get there.
100%. And I do think change is hard for a lot of people. And being uncomfortable is really hard for people. Learning to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? Like if we could all just work on that, I think things would be better. But with that, I've got one last question for you. For us, this episode on KDN really mattered around the systems around a teacher. How do we improve teachers? Because that system directly impacts your child. And we can't build a great environment for kids unless that system is performing to its best. So thank you, Ironetta, for everything that you've shared with us today. But my last question for you, you started as a classroom teacher. In one sentence, what did you need in those early years that the system wasn't giving you?
I think that my love for teaching came from that had amazing teachers. So when I transitioned and I became a teacher, and I'm a College of Ed major, so I went to school to teach. I did an internship. I did all the things that, it's not, that it's different now when we think about those that are going into classrooms. But the system that we had at the time was a system that was very supportive, honestly. They supported me as a new teacher. They supported me from a university perspective. So the university had someone that came into the school to do observations and give feedback. And they also supported from the school perspective, where there was an administrator that was responsible for coming in and giving feedback. So I think the system was in place. But again, it goes back to the trust part of it, because I think that it was important. And because honestly, I know it's hard for you to believe, but right out of the gate, I was an amazing teacher. I was really, really good.
Not
I
surprised
was
by
a
that.
great teacher, and I knew that. And so it was, and my university, gave me a lot of real great support around that and going through, I had 2 pre-internships before a full internship. So I had a lot of opportunity to practice. I mean, we had a daycare when I was growing up. I've been teaching my dolls since I was 6. And so, it was all of those things. But where it comes trust is it was important that the person that I trusted, the person that was giving me feedback, that I knew that their feedback was authentic feedback, and it had nothing else to do with anything other than my instructional delivery and my pedagogy. And I think right now, as we think about, what teachers need, determining, and teachers now are needing some different things sometimes, because many of them don't have as many of the experiences as I even had going into the classroom. So creating as much opportunity for them to try it out before they're the only one, before they're completely responsible, to have someone that they can have authentic conversation with and get feedback from, and to know that the person that is evaluating them or observing them is doing that only from a space of improving their practice, that they want to help them get better, or they want to help them move from good to great or great to excellent, and that's really the purpose.
And if I had to pick one word to summarize this entire episode, it actually boils down to trust. And I think that is such an important thing to recognize. So many different factors have to have trust in the system and that it's working correctly. First off, Ironetta, I just want to thank you for your time. This was amazing. We loved having you here and your perspective. So few people have done what you have done, from teacher to superintendent to now helping other superintendents do their work. You
Yes.
just literally cover this from 360 degrees. And for that, we are so grateful. New episodes of KDN drop every week on Spotify and YouTube. And if this one hit for you, share it. The people in your life who have kids in school need to hear this. And we'll see you next week. And thanks again to our guest, Ironetta Wright.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here.